The sterile scent of packing tape and freshly wiped countertops was the dominant aroma of my life for those final weeks. My apartment, usually a haven of quiet order, had been systematically disassembled. Every book was boxed, every file secured, every piece of furniture draped in white sheets, transforming the space into a tomb awaiting my return. I was preparing for deployment, and for Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins. Preparation meant absolute mental and physical compartmentalization. My focus had to be a razor's edge, honed for the intricate, high-stakes legal labyrinth of a forward operating environment. My orders were unambiguous. High-priority movement to a kinetic theater of operations. My role as a Judge Advocate General JAG officer meant I would be advising commanders on the law of armed conflict, rules of engagement, and prosecuting complex, sensitive cases under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This wasn't a desk job in Bahrain. This was the tip of the spear, requiring 100% mission readiness. The reality of that commitment was simple. I could not manage my civilian life. I had spent years building a financial foundation that was supposed to secure my future outside the uniform. Every deployment bonus, every differential pay, every penny of my accumulated VA benefits earmarked for retirement tit was all meticulously saved, invested, and protected. I was aiming to buy a small property near the water upon my return, a place where I could finally unpack my soul after years of packing my life into duffel bags. Now, with the countdown ticking, I faced the unavoidable logistical hurdle of managing those assets while I was thousands of miles away, operating under conditions that made a simple phone call a security risk. I needed a power of attorney PO, a legal guardian for my finances, someone who could pay the few bills I still had, handle unexpected property issues, and ensure my investments weren't left to rot. This was where the professional rigor clashed violently with the personal necessity. As a JAG officer, I understood the terrifying, absolute scope of a POA better than most civil attorneys. I knew the fiduciary duties it imposed and the catastrophic potential for abuse. Granting a POA is essentially handing over the keys to your entire financial existence, trusting the recipient to act solely in your best interest. It is a federal trust, especially when granted by an active duty service member whose assets are often protected under specific statutes. I ran through my options. My closest friends were either deployed themselves, or civilian colleagues whose lives were too busy to burden with my complex portfolio. I had no spouse, no children. That left David, my brother. The choice was not made with confidence. It was made with a sinking stomach, and the desperate hope that blood loyalty would outweigh character flaws. David was, to put it mildly, financially chaotic. He was a perennial dreamer, a man of grand, failed ventures. I had bailed him out of debt twice in the last 5 years, once for a disastrous artisanal coffee kiosk, and once for a cryptocurrency scheme that evaporated overnight. He was charming, persuasive, and utterly unreliable. I sat in my barren living room, staring at the thick folder of POA documents. The internal debate was agonizing. Asterisk, he's family. Asterisk, I argued with myself, the voice thin and pleading. Asterisk, he knows what this money represents. He knows I'm risking my life. Surely, the sanctity of my service, my sacrifice will compel him to respect this trust. Asterisk, it was a prayer, not a calculated risk assessment. I called him over under the pretense of a final farewell dinner. Though the food was lukewarm takeout, eaten off plastic plates, when he arrived, he was late, of course, smelling faintly of cheap cologne, and the optimistic sweat of a man perpetually chasing a quick score. He didn't seem to notice the severity of the situation. He just saw a free meal and a chance to ask if I could leave him my car while I was gone. So, the big deployment, he said, gesturing vaguely at the boxers. You know, if you ever need someone to manage some of those investments, I've got some incredible contacts in the fintech space right now. Truly disruptive. I cut him off, my voice sharp, professional, slipping into the tone I used when addressing a difficult witness. David, stop. That is precisely why we are here. I slid the documents across the table: the general durable power of attorney, the specific financial instruments list, and the legal explanation of fiduciary responsibility. This is not an opportunity, David. This is a responsibility. A severe one, I explained, tapping the section detailing my VA home loan benefits and the accrued deployment pay. This money is my future. It is protected by federal law because I earned it serving overseas. If you misuse this, you are not just breaching a contract. You are committing a federal crime against a deployed service member. I watched his eyes skim the pages. He wasn't reading the clauses. He was counting the signatures required. Look, Sarah, I get it. I'm responsible. I'll keep the lights on, pay the condo fees, Whatever. Easy money. He grinned, that infuriating, casual grin that always signaled his lack of true engagement. It is asterisk, not asterisk, easy money, I insisted, leaning forward. This document gives you the authority to liquidate my stocks, empty my savings, and sell my assets. Do you understand the scope of that power? I am trusting you, implicitly, to touch nothing unless absolutely necessary for upkeep. I pointed to the clause defining his fiduciary duty. This means you must act in my best interest, always. Not your best interest. Not your disruptive friend's interest. Mine. This isn't a blank check, David. This is my life. Treat it like a federal trust. I needed him to understand the gravity, the sheer weight of what he was accepting. I was laying my financial security, the culmination of a decade of grinding military service, at his feet. But my warnings seemed to slide off him like water off a duck's back. He signed the documents quickly, the pen scratching impatiently on the heavy bond paper. He didn't even keep a copy. The signing felt less like an agreement and more like a surrender. As a JAG officer, I prided myself on risk mitigation and clear legal strategy. Choosing David violated every professional principle I held dear. Yet, here I was, trusting a man who couldn't balance his own checkbook with the entirety of my life savings. After the paperwork was complete, the mood shifted back to the strained normalcy of a family farewell. He talked about his new idea, personalized dog walking app, and how this was finally going to be the one that made him rich. I barely listened. My mind was already in the desert, running through the complicated legal precedents I would need to master for the trials ahead. My final conversation with him was brief, standing by the curb as the military car idled, waiting to take me to the base. Just keep things steady, David, I said, handing him the spare key and the thick folder of my financial statements, sealed with a note detailing emergency contacts. When I get back, I expect my accounts to be untouched, perhaps even grown if the market cooperates. Don't be stupid. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt patronizing rather than comforting. Go save the world, Sarah. I've got your back here. I didn't believe him. I didn't believe the sincerity in his eyes, nor the casual promise in his tone. But there was no time left for doubt. The car door opened, and I slid into the back seat, the heavy weight of my deployment gear pressing against me. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the apartment, then at David, standing there, holding my life in his hand. I was flying into a war zone where the dangers were external, clear, and could be managed with training and discipline. Yet, somehow, entrusting my financial security to my greedy, feckless brother felt like the bigger, more terrifying, and utterly uncontrolled risk. I pushed the dread down, locking it away behind the walls of professional duty. My mission was waiting. I had a job to do, and until that job was finished, the fate of my savings, and the dangerous trust I had placed in David, had to be forgotten. The uniform demanded absolute focus, and I was going to give it everything I had. The thought of David and his casual betrayal was the last personal weakness I allowed myself before the long flight overseas. I had given him my trust. Now, I had to pray he was worthy of it. The air that hit me stepping off the military transport plane in Norfolk wasn't the searing, dry heat of the Persian Gulf, nor the dust-choked scent of the forward operating base I had just left. It was thick, humid, and smelled undeniably like home-like asphalt, salt air, and the promise of rain. Relief washed over me, a physical weight lifting from my shoulders that had been burdened by the constant vigilance required of a JAG officer operating in a high-threat zone. I was exhausted down to my bones, but the exhaustion was good. It was the residue of a mission accomplished. I grabbed my duffel bag, the heavy canvas still smelling faintly of jet fuel and desert sand, and made my way through the terminal. For months, my world had been confined to legal briefs concerning rules of engagement, advising commanders on complex international law, and prosecuting service members who made catastrophic mistakes under pressure. Now, I was Sarah Jenkins again, Lieutenant Commander, yes, but also a woman looking forward to finding a quiet house in Virginia Beach. Perhaps finally settling down, using the savings I had meticulously built over years of deployment pay and careful investment. My apartment, which I had left sterile and packed, was exactly as I remembered it. The silence was deafening after the constant thrum of base life. I didn't even bother unpacking the entire bag. My first priority wasn't sleep, or food, or even calling friends. It was financial security. I needed to log in, move some funds around, and start house hunting immediately. The savings were substantial enough for a solid down payment on a place near the base, finally providing the stability I craved. I sat down at the small desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. I pulled up the banking application, typing in my credentials with the practiced ease of someone who checks their accounts religiously, even from a bunker overseas. The initial loading screen felt agonizingly slow. I took a deep breath, anticipating the reassuring seven-figure number that represented years of deferred gratification and higher-esque service pay. Then, the number appeared. It wasn't 7 figures. It wasn't 6. It wasn't even 5. The primary savings account balance read $317.42. My first thought was that I had logged into the wrong account. I checked the routing numbers, the account name, my name, Sarah Jenkins. I refreshed the page. $317.42. A cold, visceral dread began to coil in my stomach, tighter and sharper than any fear I had felt during a rocket attack. I clicked over to the investment portfolio. The page was blank, save for a note, account closed. Funds liquidated. I checked the specialized account where my VA disability benefits and retirement fund matching were held. That, too, was drained, showing a minimum required balance. The systematic nature of the zeros on the screen wasn't a mistake. It was a blueprint. It was the precise, devastating execution of a financial hostile takeover. Years of deployment pay. Bonuses, my future security gone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My JAG training took over immediately, filtering the emotional shock through the cold lens of professional analysis. Asterisk, identify the breach, trace the transaction path, establish intent. Asterisk, I immediately locked down all remaining accounts and initiated a full transaction history download. I saw the pattern instantly. Large, irregular withdrawals, wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and massive, lump sum liquidations of my blue-chip investments. All transactions were authorized under the power of attorney POA. I had reluctantly signed, granting David access to manage my affairs while I was deployed. He hadn't managed. He had plundered. The realization was a physical blow, worse than any interrogation I had ever conducted. It wasn't just the money. It was the monumental, staggering betrayal of trust, magnified by the context of my service. I had been risking my life, upholding the law in a dangerous theater of operations, while my own brother was systematically robbing me blind back home. He hadn't just stolen my savings. He had stolen the peace of mind I needed to do my job overseas. I didn't call the police yet. I needed to see his face. I needed to understand the depth of his audacity before I brought the full weight of the legal system down upon him. I tracked David down easily enough. He hadn't been subtle. The transaction history showed large payments to a high-end complex in the newer, more fashionable part of town, the kind of place he could never afford on his own. I drove there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I was wearing civilian clothes, but inside, the uniform was already tightening around me. I found his name on the intercom list. The designation Penthouse Unit 501, a cruel irony. When he opened the door, the smell of expensive cologne and new leather hit me. He looked better than I had ever seen him. Designer jeans, a sharp casual shirt, and a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Sarah, you're back. Didn't expect you so soon," he said, his voice too loud, too cheerful. He made a move to hug me. I stopped him with a raised hand, a gesture honed by years of controlling the flow of a courtroom. My voice, when I spoke, was low, measured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice I used for cross-examination when I wanted the witness to feel the cold steel of the impending trap. "David," I said, stepping past him into the ridiculously opulent living room. "Where's the money?" He laughed, a nervous, dismissive sound. "Money? What money, sis? You just got back. Relax. I took great care of your stuff." I opened the folder I had brought, containing only 3 printouts. The POA document, the savings account balance, and the summary of the liquidated investment portfolio. I placed them on his polished glass coffee table. "I am not here to relax, David. I am here to discuss the breach of fiduciary duty you executed under this power of attorney while I was deployed. My accounts are empty. My retirement funds are gone. Where did $870,000 go?" His face finally shifted, the casual arrogance cracking slightly, replaced by a flicker of panic, quickly masked by defensive anger. "Oh, come on, Sarah. Don't be dramatic. I borrowed it. It was just sitting there, doing nothing. I had a huge opportunity at tech venture, guaranteed to double the investment. It just took a little longer to mature. A little longer," I countered, my eyes scanning the room, the expensive sound system, the imported art, the panoramic view. "Your venture seems to have materialized primarily into luxury consumer goods and rent on a unit you cannot afford. I see transfers to Las Vegas casinos and deposits for a new sports car. That is not an investment, David. That is calculated theft. He threw his hands up, frustration overcoming his facade. Why do you always have to be so damn military about everything? It's family money. We're family. I was going to pay you back once the deal hit. No, I corrected, my voice dropping lower, emphasizing every syllable. It is my money. Money earned during years of active duty service. Money that includes federal VA benefits designated for my future. You signed a federal POA, David. You didn't just borrow from your sister. You committed a felony breach of trust against an active duty service member. That's when the truly cruel part emerged. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with genuine resentment, dismissing my entire career in a single, hateful burst. The Navy pays you enough, Sarah. You're a high-ranking officer. You were exaggerating about needing it. You'll make it all back in 6 months. I was the one who was struggling. I had a great opportunity, and you were just sitting on a pile of cash you didn't need. You were gone anyway. You barely even missed it. The words hit me like shrapnel. Asterisk, you barely even missed it. Asterisk, that was the moment the sister died. He hadn't just stolen the money. He had invalidated the sacrifice. He had looked at my years of service along deployments. The constant danger, the stress of military justice, and deemed the resulting financial security superfluous. He had spat on my uniform, my duty, and the entire concept of military fidelity. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The cold clarity of pure, professional rage settled over me. There would be no mediation, no family reconciliation, no forgiveness. This was no longer a personal dispute. It was a matter of law, duty, and justice. You are mistaken, David, I said, gathering the papers from the table, handling them as if they were evidence in a murder trial. I missed every penny. And because you believe my service and my financial security were disposable, you have just ensured that you will face the maximum possible consequences. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the cool metal handle. I will not be hiring an attorney, David, I informed him. I am the attorney, and I will prosecute this case myself. I will use every federal statute available to me. You will not only repay every cent, but you will pay for the cost of litigation, and you will face criminal referral. Do you understand? He stared at me, the panic finally overwhelming the arrogance. He stammered something about calling mom, about family, about being sorry. I didn't acknowledge the words. I walked out, closing the heavy door behind me. Driving away from that ridiculous penthouse, I felt the shift complete. The grief and personal devastation were compartmentalized, locked away behind the walls of professional duty. My focus was absolute. I was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, JAG Corps, and David was now officially the defendant. He had chosen to engage in legal warfare against a highly trained military prosecutor who knew the federal system intimately. He had underestimated me, not just as his sister, but as an officer of the court. And that, I knew, was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. I drove straight back to my apartment, pulled out my laptop, and began drafting the complaint. This was not going to be a messy civil suit. This was going to be a perfectly executed legal maneuver designed to crush him under the weight of federal law. My mission was waiting. And this time, it was personal. The apartment was silent, the kind of crushing quiet that settles in after a deployment, when the adrenaline finally drains out and the domestic reality hits you like a physical blow. I had spent my first week home functioning on autopilot jet lag, unpacking the bare essentials and the cold, terrifying realization that my financial life had been systematically looted. But the time for shock had passed. The time for grief was strictly postponed. I walked into my small spare room, which had been designated as my home office before I left, and I closed the door on the rest of my life. I didn't just need to organize papers. I needed a complete mental overhaul. I needed to shift identities. Sarah, the betrayed sister, was useless here. Lieutenant Commander Jenkins, JAG Corps, was mandatory. I put on the mental uniform. It wasn't the crisp khaki or the service dress blues, but the mindset, absolute focus, compartmentalization of emotion, and an unwavering adherence to procedure. I saw the stacks of documents on my desk, bank statements, investment summaries, the executed power of attorney, and I stopped seeing them as relics of my ruined future. They were exhibits A through Z, the components of a meticulously crafted case. My first act was clearing the room of anything personal. Family photographs went into a drawer. The framed commendation from my last mission was turned facing the wall. I needed sterility. I needed a war room where the only relationship that mattered was that between counsel and evidence. David was no longer my brother. He was *, the defendant *, an entity whose actions had to be dissected, cataloged, and ultimately punished by the full weight of the law. I opened my laptop, ignoring the urge to call a local attorney. That was David's expectation. He assumed I would hire some general practice lawyer who would treat this as a messy, low-stakes civil dispute, a family feud to be settled with mediation and a repayment plan. But I knew better. Mediation implies mutual respect and good faith, neither of which David possessed. A state civil suit would only grant me restitution, which he could drag out for years, dismissing the severity of his crime. My training was my weapon. I wasn't just *A* lawyer. I was a specialist in federal jurisdiction, military statutes, and the stringent rules governing fiduciary duty for service members. I knew the specific, terrifying clauses David had violated. Clauses designed precisely to protect officers like me while we were deployed in hostile theaters. I focused my gaze on the primary objective, elevating this case from a state tort into a matter of federal gravity. I began drafting the complaint, not in the flowery, statistical, generalized language of a typical civil filing, but in the precise, clinical terminology required when addressing a federal judge who understands statutory violation. I meticulously tied his actions to the relevant United States codes. The misuse of a POA, granted by an active duty service member, that was the key. I highlighted the fact that a significant portion of the stolen funds originated from my VA disability benefits and accumulated deployment pay, both of which carry specific federal protections. This wasn't just theft. This was an aggravated breach of fiduciary duty coupled with the calculated misappropriation of funds designated for a service member's welfare. I wanted the judge to see not a victimized sister, but a violation of a public trust. The process was exhausting, a brutal exercise in self-inflicted pain. I had to look at every single unauthorized transaction. I subpoenaed every single bank record, not just from my accounts, but from David's as well. I needed to trace the money's journey. Late into the night, I sat surrounded by paper, the smell of toner and stale coffee filling the air. I used the same rigorous methodology I employed when preparing evidence for a general court-martial. I created massive color-coded binders. Binder 1, the contract. This contained the original POA, signed and notarized, with the specific clauses regarding permissible expenditures highlighted in yellow. David's signature was Exhibit A1. Binder 2, the breach. This was the chronological record of withdrawals and transfers, showing the systematic depletion of my savings, cross-referenced with the dates of my deployment. I highlighted the massive wire transfers that occurred immediately after I lost contact when I entered a secure forward operating base. Binder 3, the intent. This was the most damning evidence. It wasn't enough to prove he took the money. I had to prove he took it knowingly and maliciously . I had subpoenaed his receipts and investment statements. My money didn't go to paying a sudden medical bill or an unexpected mortgage. It went to a failed, high-risk cryptocurrency venture he had bragged about, lavish vacations to the Caribbean, and the down payment on a boat he certainly couldn't afford on his own salary. The paper trail proved mens res . He gambled my career savings on his greed. Every time I felt the cold sting of betrayal rise up, I forced myself to categorize it, to file it away. Emotion was leakage. Precision was power. I treated David's financial records like the enemy's intelligence, flawed, arrogant, and ultimately leading to his own downfall. I remember one specific receipt, tucked into a stack of restaurant bills. A $1,200 dinner he had charged to my investment account while I was living off MREs in a tent with sand constantly blowing into my mouth. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply tabbed the receipt, labeled it Exhibit C47, extravagant personal expenditure, and moved on. The cold, precise organization was my armor. When the entire case file was assembled 3 heavy binders, organized with military-grade rigor, I felt a shift in the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a claim. This was an indictment. I drove downtown to the courthouse to file the lawsuit. I bypassed the standard civil forms and filed a complaint that was heavy with citations of federal case law and specific statutes governing military personnel. The clerk who took the papers blinked at the density of the initial filing, and then came the signature. I signed the documents pro se electing to represent myself. Below my name, I wrote my title, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, JAG Corps. It was a deliberate, calculated move. It told the court, the clerk, and soon, David, exactly who they were dealing with. I wasn't just a plaintiff. I was an officer of the court, intimately familiar with the system, and I was holding the reins of this prosecution with a grip of iron. I knew the moment David received the summons and the accompanying mountain of documentation, he would be confused. He expected a terse letter from a lawyer demanding repayment. Instead, he received a document drafted with the rigor of a federal prosecutor, citing laws he had probably never heard of, threatening consequences he couldn't possibly comprehend. His reaction, I predicted, would be twofold. Initial panic, followed quickly by arrogant dismissal. He would assume I was bluffing, that I was too busy or too emotional to see it through. He would likely view my pro se status as a sign of weakness that I couldn't afford a real lawyer. That arrogance was my most valuable strategic asset. I needed him to maintain that condescending belief until the moment he stood before the judge. I needed him to believe that he was simply arguing with his little sister over money, not facing the full, unyielding force of a military legal officer seeking justice under federal mandate. I drove back to my apartment, the empty space where my savings used to be replaced by the quiet, humming satisfaction of preparation. The legal battlefield was set. My mission was waiting. And this time, it was personal, professional, and perfectly designed to ensure David's comprehensive downfall. I had done my job. Now, I just had to wait for the court date. The air in the courtroom was thick, smelling faintly of stale coffee and polished wood, though smell of institutional seriousness. I walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit, the civilian uniform of power and competence, feeling every inch the lieutenant commander I was. Despite the lack of brass on my shoulders, my movements were economical, my briefcase heavy with the meticulously organized evidence that would dismantle my brother's life. I was Sarah Jenkins, pro se counsel, and my mission was clear: secure, justice, restitution, and accountability. I ignored the familiar anxiety that usually accompanies entering a courtroom, replacing it with the cold, measured focus I employed when advising on complex international law cases. I had compartmentalized the pain. The sister had stayed outside the swinging doors. Only the officer remained. David was already seated at the defendant's table. He looked entirely too comfortable, leaning back in his chair, attempting a friendly nod toward the bailiff. When his eyes met mine, he offered a weak, practiced smile, the same smile he used when asking our parents for another loan. It was a smile of misplaced confidence, fueled by the assumption that I was merely an emotional relative seeking small claims revenge. He had hired no attorney, believing, I presumed, that he could talk his way out of the situation or appeal to the judge's sense of familial reconciliation. I did not return his gaze. I looked past him, setting my organized stacks of binders precisely on the table. My posture was military straight, my hands resting lightly on the documents. I was ready. When Judge Thompson entered, the room snapped to attention. He was a man with deep lines around his eyes, the kind of judge who had seen everything from petty theft to complex fraud. He scanned the room, his gaze resting momentarily on me, the lone plaintiff representing herself against her brother. I offered a brief, professional nod, acknowledging his authority without fanfare. "We are here in the matter of Jenkins versus Jenkins," the judge stated, his voice gravelly. "Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed with your opening statement." I rose immediately, my movement fluid and precise. I did not approach the podium immediately. I stood by my table, addressing the judge directly and deliberately. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and pitched perfectly for the acoustics of the room. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. The defendant, David Jenkins, accepted a legally binding power of attorney fiduciary role from the plaintiff, an active duty service member, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, prior to her deployment to a hostile theater of operations. I didn't start with the money. I started with the law. This breach is not merely a civil tort," I continued, making direct eye contact. "It is an aggravated breach of trust, compounding the violation of state fiduciary duty with elements that impinge upon federal statutes designed to protect the assets of deployed military personnel. I intend to demonstrate, through irrefutable documentary evidence, that the defendant engaged in a systematic, calculated depletion of the plaintiff's life savings, including funds specifically earmarked as VA benefits and accumulated deployment pay." I cited the relevant United States Code sections regarding the penalties for misuse of a military POA. I used the term *mens res guilty mind when discussing his intent. I did not use the word brother or betrayal. I used defendant and statutory violation. I watched Judge Thompson closely. I saw the moment his casual posture stiffened. Most pro se plaintiffs stumble through emotional appeals or irrelevant narratives. I had just delivered an opening statement that sounded like it came directly from the U.S. Attorney's office. He picked up his pen and began taking notes. No longer merely observing, David, however, looked confused. He shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to the empty chair beside him, probably wondering why I hadn't cried yet. Mr. Jenkins, the judge addressed David. Do you wish to offer a rebuttal statement? David scrambled to his feet, adjusting his ill-fitting tie. Yes, Your Honor. Look, this is a family thing. My sister is making a big deal out of a temporary liquidity issue. I was going to pay it back. It was an investment opportunity, Your Honor, a great one. She just came back from overseas and she's stressed out. Maybe a little overdramatic about the numbers? I allowed a flicker of professional disdain to cross my expression before locking it down again. He had just admitted to taking the money and minimized my service. Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, the judge said dryly. Ms. Jenkins, please proceed with your presentation of evidence. This was where the war was won. I approached the evidence easel. My presentation was a masterclass in legal logistics. Your Honor, I now introduce Exhibit A, the original durable power of attorney document, signed by the defendant on May 14, 2 years prior to my return. Note specifically Section 4, which explicitly prohibits the use of funds for speculative ventures or personal enrichment. I projected the document clearly. I didn't rely on the judge reading it. I guided his eye to the precise clause. Next, Exhibit B, I continued, smoothly transitioning to the next binder. This is a comprehensive, month-by-month financial statement detailing the systematic depletion of accounts. We begin with the initial balance upon my deployment, $387,452. This included $95,000 in accumulated VA housing benefits federal funds, Your Honor. I didn't fumble with the papers. Every page was tabbed, every total highlighted. I presented the timeline like a prosecuting attorney, detailing a complex conspiracy. In July, 2 months after deployment, the defendant executed the first unauthorized transfer, $50,000, wired to a non-military affiliated account named Phoenix Ventures. In October, an additional $120,000 was liquidated from my long-term investment portfolio. By the time of my return, Exhibit B, page 47, clearly shows a remaining balance of $412. I let the number hang in the air. $412. Years of service, reduced to pocket change by a stroke of my brother's pen. David's lawyerless table was a mess of crumpled notes and half-empty water bottles. My table was surgical. And finally, Your Honor, Exhibit C, the documentation of the expenditures. This is not disputed business loss. This is clear personal enrichment. Exhibit C includes receipts for a luxury condominium rental in Miami, payments for a high-end European car lease, and multiple large payments to credit card companies. Clearly unrelated to my financial obligations or maintenance of my property, I showed the pictures of the car lease agreement and the Miami rental deposit. The evidence was damning because it was simple, organized, and impossible to argue against. It wasn't just that he took the money. It was what he bought with a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own, paid for with my sacrifice. Judge Thompson leaned back, rubbing his chin. He wasn't just impressed by the evidence. He was assessing the plaintiff. He had seen very few lawyers, let alone pro se litigants, handle evidentiary procedure with such cold, clinical precision. Ms. Jenkins, the judge said slowly, your organization is, shall we say, exceptional. Does the defendant wish to cross-examine the exhibits? David stood up, flustered. I object to the photos, Your Honor. They're prejudicial. She's trying to make me look bad. Mr. Jenkins? The judge corrected him sternly. The photos are receipts of transactions executed using the plaintiff's funds, which you admit to controlling via the POA. They are relevant to the claim of unauthorized expenditure. Objection overruled. Do you have any legal questions regarding the documentation of the transfers? David stammered. No, Your Honor. I just meant, understood. The judge cut him off, clearly irritated by the lack of legal rigor. Ms. Jenkins, you may call your next witness. I call the defendant, David Jenkins. To the stand? I stated. David's face fell. He hadn't expected me to put him on the stand. Certainly not with the intent to cross-examine him myself. He shuffled up to the witness box, swearing in with a nervous hand. He still held on to the delusion that he could appeal to my shared history. He was sorely mistaken. I approached the witness box, standing directly in front of him, but maintaining a respectful distance. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in the calm, measured tone of a JAG officer interviewing a hostile witness under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Mr. Jenkins, I began, you testified in your response that the funds were used for investment opportunities. Is that correct? Yes, Sarah. I told you objection, Your Honor, I interjected immediately, cutting off his attempt at narrative. The defendant must answer the question and refrain from offering unsolicited explanations. Sustained, the judge nodded. Answer the question, Mr. Jenkins. Yes, counsel. Investment opportunities. Thank you. Can you state for the court what specific legal or fiduciary authority you possessed, under the terms of Exhibit A, the power of attorney, to initiate a transfer of $120,000 from a diversified index fund into Phoenix Ventures? David swallowed hard. Well, the POA gave me authority over the accounts. It gave you authority to *manage them for the plaintiff's benefit. Mr. Jenkins, did you consult with any financial advisor regarding the higher-risk nature of Phoenix Ventures? No, but I did a lot of research myself. Did you inform the plaintiff, who was deployed overseas, that you were liquidating her retirement assets for a high-risk private venture? I couldn't, you were busy. Sarah, you were on deployment. So, you unilaterally decided to risk nearly $500,000 of federal benefits and military pay without the consent of the fiduciary's principal, who was literally serving her country abroad. Is that your testimony? He squirmed. I took a risk. People take risks. And did the POA Exhibit A authorize you to pay for your personal luxury condominium in Miami using the plaintiff's funds? I needed a place to work on the investment, he insisted, his voice rising in panic. Objection. Your Honor. Relevance. The defendant is attempting to introduce non-pecuniary context to mask a clear statutory violation. The question demands a yes or no answer regarding the authorization granted in the POA. Sustained. The judge said, tapping his pen sharply. Mr. Jenkins, answer the question. Did the POA authorize the payment of your personal rent? David looked down, defeated. No. I continued the cross-examination for another 40 minutes, meticulously dissecting every transaction. I didn't ask, why did you betray me? I asked, did you possess the legal authority under Section 4B of the POA to execute Transfer 217 on October 19th? I was a machine of inquiry, demanding only facts and legal admissions. Every time David tried to introduce emotion, we're family. I felt terrible. I immediately shut him down with a procedural objection that the judge upheld. By the time I finished, David was physically shaking, not from anger, but from the cold realization that he had walked into a legal ambush laid by someone who understood procedural law better than most practicing attorneys. He had expected tears. He got a deposition. As David stumbled off the stand, wiping his brow, I returned to my table. I saw Judge Thompson lean forward again, his eyes narrowed, studying the way I organized my notes, the precision of my objections, and the flawless structure of my argument. I knew the moment I had completely shed the image of the distraught sister. I was not a victim seeking comfort. I was an officer demanding legal accountability. The judge wasn't just listening to the facts of the theft. He was trying to place my training. He was seeing the rigor, the discipline, and the absolute command of procedure that only comes from years of high-stakes federal practice. The courtroom fell silent as the judge requested a brief recess before closing arguments. I sat perfectly still, my breathing regulated, my focus unwavering. I had laid the foundation perfectly. David was exposed, the evidence was incontrovertible, and the judge was fully aware that this case transcended the local civil docket. I had done my job. I had transformed the personal betrayal into a professional legal victory. I was ready to deliver the final blow. The air in the courtroom had solidified into an unbearable pressure, thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and latent anxiety. I didn't move. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my spine rigid, my hands resting lightly on the organized stack of exhibits that represented my financial ruin and subsequent legal resurrection. Across the aisle, David fidgeted, his initial bravado having evaporated into a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He had underestimated me. He had confused sisterly grief with professional incompetence. The judge, a man named Henderson, whose reputation for judicial diligence was well-earned, returned to the bench. He didn't look at either of us immediately. He meticulously arranged his notes, a deliberate, almost theatrical delay that amplified the silence. This was the quiet before the cannon shot. Counsel, Judge Henderson stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble. Are you prepared for closing arguments? I stood immediately, smoothly, without rustling a single piece of paper. David scrambled to his feet a moment later, still trying to mimic the etiquette he hadn't bothered to learn. Yes, Your Honor, I confirmed, my voice clear and utterly devoid of inflection. I walked slowly to the lectern, placing only a single index card containing my outline, not that I needed it. The argument was etched into the deepest recesses of my mind, a roadmap of betrayal and statutory violation. I began by acknowledging the court's time, a formality that transitioned instantly into the brutal reality of the case. Your Honor, this is not a complex matter of contractual interpretation or ambiguous debt. This is a clear, documented, and egregious breach of fiduciary duty under a legally executed power of attorney. I didn't use flowery language. I used the language of the law, the language of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and the United States Code. I spoke of the gravity of the trust placed in the defendant. A trust predicated on the plaintiff's active duty status and deployment to a hostile theater. The power of attorney I granted the defendant, Exhibit A, was explicit. His fiduciary duty was absolute, to manage, protect, and maintain my assets while I executed my duties as a commissioned officer of the United States Navy deployed overseas. He did not manage. He did not protect. He systematically looted. I directed the judge's attention back to the exhibits, not physically, but through precise citation. Exhibit C, Your Honor, details the timeline. Within 3 weeks of my departure, the defendant began liquidating my investment accounts. Within 60 days, he had drained the entirety of my accumulated deployment pay funds earmarked for my retirement and housing purchase. And, perhaps most reprehensibly, he accessed and misused funds specifically designated as VA benefits. Funds protected under federal law. I paused, allowing the weight of that last point to settle. I had spent weeks compiling the legal precedent that tied the civil theft to the federal implications. The defense offered by the defendant was that he was borrowing the funds for a high-yield opportunity. This is a transparent fabrication. The evidence shows reckless, self-serving expenditure, luxury vehicles, high-end travel, and failed, uninsured business ventures, I stated. My tone sharp as surgical steel. The asterisk mens rea asterisk. The criminal intent is demonstrated by the systematic nature of the withdrawals, the complete lack of communication, and the subsequent arrogance displayed when confronted with the evidence of his crime. I looked directly at Judge Henderson, who was now taking notes with focused intensity. Your Honor, a judgment of simple restitution is insufficient. This court has the opportunity, and I argue the duty, to signal that the assets and financial security of deployed service members are not soft targets for opportunistic relatives. The defendant's actions constitute not merely a civil wrong, but a profound violation of the trust inherent in military service. I concluded by keeping it simple, referencing the dollar amount and the specific federal statutes I believed were violated. We request full restitution, statutory interest, and punitive damages appropriate for an aggravated breach of fiduciary duty. Thank you, Your Honor. I returned to my seat, my movements economical and precise. I felt the courtroom exhale. David, looking terrified, stood for his closing. It was a disaster. He stammered, tried to introduce emotional pleas about his own financial struggles, and begged the judge to view this as a misunderstanding between siblings. I mean, she's rich, Your Honor. She's a Navy lawyer. She didn't need that money right away. I was going to pay it back. I instinctively raised my hand. Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant and self-serving speculation. The defendant is attempting to introduce non-pecuniary context to mask a clear statutory violation. Judge Henderson nodded wearily. Sustained. Mr. Jenkins, confine your closing to the facts presented in evidence. David wilted, his face crumpling. He had no facts. He had only excuses. He sat down with a defeated thud. The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, a small audience of clerks and observers, all holding their breath. He steepled his fingers, staring at the ceiling. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. I kept my breathing slow, mimicking the rhythm of the ocean I knew so well. I had presented the case perfectly. Now I had to wait for the verdict. Judge Henderson's eyes finally settled on me, a long, assessing look that seemed to penetrate the dark suit and the professional veneer, searching for the sister underneath. But all he found was the lieutenant commander. Then, the critical moment arrived. The judge leaned forward slightly, turning his head toward his clerk, Miss Davies. He brought his hand up, covering the microphone on his bench, a standard judicial maneuver to ensure privacy. I watched, my eyes tracking the subtle movements of his lips. I had spent years in high-stakes negotiations and interrogations. Reading body language and microexpressions was second nature. My focus locked onto his mouth. He spoke softly, just a few syllables, intended only for Ms. Davies. I saw the words form, crystal clear, asterisk, she single quotes, as, JAG. Asterisk, a cold wave of vindication washed over me. He had recognized it. He hadn't just seen a plaintiff seeking justice. He had recognized the rigorous, specialized training, the federal mindset, the absolute command of the law that defined my professional life. That whisper, that single, quiet observation was the ultimate professional acknowledgement. Across the aisle, David hadn't caught the whisper, but he saw the judge's expression change, a nod of respect, directed toward me, and a sudden, sharp downturn of his mouth, directed toward David. David's entire demeanor collapsed. He finally understood the magnitude of his error. He hadn't just stolen my savings. He had triggered a full-scale legal war against a trained military prosecutor. The realization hit him like a physical blow, draining the color from his face. His smirk was gone, replaced by naked, visceral panic. Judge Henderson straightened, removing his hand from the microphone. The gavel lay motionless before him. The court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the detailed statutory arguments presented by the plaintiff, Ms. Jenkins. He didn't call me Lieutenant Commander, but the acknowledgement was implicit in his tone. The evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. The defendant, David Jenkins, was entrusted with an absolute fiduciary duty under the power of attorney. He systematically and intentionally violated that trust for personal gain, resulting in the depletion of the plaintiff's assets, including funds derived from military service and government benefits. The judge picked up a sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the prepared ruling. Therefore, the court finds a defendant, David Jenkins, liable for the full amount sought by the plaintiff, totaling $457,812.93, $457,812.93. Judgment is entered for the plaintiff, and the defendant is ordered to make immediate and total restitution. A small victory. But I knew the real hammer was yet to drop. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses, his gaze hardening. However, the court cannot ignore the specific federal elements introduced into this case. The plaintiff meticulously demonstrated that the funds stolen included VA benefits and assets protected under provisions related to active duty service members' financial security. He leaned forward again, his voice now carrying the weight of institutional authority. The court finds that the breach of fiduciary duty, combined with the context of a military power of attorney and the misappropriation of federal funds, mandates a response beyond civil remedy. Therefore, as a matter of judicial responsibility and deterrence, this court will immediately refer the entire case file, including all subpoenaed bank records and deposition transcripts, to the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District for their review and determination regarding potential criminal prosecution under relevant sections of the United States Code related to fraud against a deployed service member. The sound of the gavel hitting the block was sharp and final, echoing through the courtroom. Court adjourned. David sprang up, stumbling, trying to call out to the judge, "Your Honor, wait. It was just a misunderstanding." The judge ignored him, already rising from the bench. Ms. Davies, the clerk, was already moving to collect the files. I sat still for a moment, letting the finality of the ruling wash over me. It was done. The restitution was ordered, and the criminal referral, the federal hammer I had been aiming for since the confrontation, was secured. David was no longer just dealing with a civil judgment. He was now facing the full, terrifying machinery of the federal government. I stood, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I used when packing my deployment bag. I didn't spare David a glance. He was standing alone, abandoned by his own arrogance, desperately trying to flag down a bailiff. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly ruined. He finally stumbled toward me, his voice a frantic whisper. "Sarah, please. You can't let them do this. You can call them off. We're family." I paused, placing my final binder into my briefcase. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with the cold, detached assessment I reserved for a defeated adversary. "We stopped being family the moment you signed that document and saw my deployment as a business opportunity," I replied, my voice low and steady. "And I can't call them off, David. The referral is a judicial order now. It's out of my hands." I zipped my briefcase closed. The weight of the leather bag felt right heavy, substantial, secure. "You stole from the Navy, David," I finished, the lieutenant commander delivering the final verdict. "And now, the Navy is coming for you." I turned and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't look back at the chaos I left behind. The relief wasn't emotional euphoria. It was the deep, quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. I had flown into a war zone and executed justice on the other side of the world. But the toughest, most necessary battle had been fought and won right here. In a local courthouse, leveraging the power and precision of the law I had sworn to uphold, I was financially restored. But, more importantly, my professional integrity, the only thing David couldn't steal, was perfectly intact. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air, ready to report back to duty. The case was closed.